Hello, welcome to Coding on Crack, where today we are going through the second episode of our Core Bluetooth series. In the last episode, if you haven't seen it yet, go back and watch it. We covered how to actually connect your iPhone to some Bluetooth device using Core Bluetooth. In this episode, we're going to look at how you actually grab that device and you look through and find different services that that device offers so that you can actually do things to or with that device from your phone. So to do this, we're going to essentially be looking through the device hierarchy. So let's jump right on into it. This is what the device hierarchy looks like. Essentially, once you have connected to a device, which is represented by the CB peripheral in Core Bluetooth, you can look for its services, represented by the CB service object in Core Bluetooth. Each service has some kind of unique ID. Now, these IDs can either be custom to the device, or there is a list of standard IDs that certain services can take on. So a heart rate service is going to be a universal ID shared by all devices. Next, you have the characteristics. These characteristics are the actual data points that you'll be interacting with. Each characteristic is stored as a CB characteristic in Core Bluetooth. They also have their own IDs, and you are able to read or write those values. In this case, this heart rate measurement characteristic allows you to read or notify. Read being you can request that data and look at it. Notify being that Bluetooth device, whenever this heart rate measurement changes, it's going to send out a notification from your phone. You can subscribe to that notification to read that new data anytime that data changes. Then you have your characteristic, your body sensor location, which just allows you to read. So they're going to have different properties that are available. If we look down here, we can just see the different levels that this information is accessed at. At the surface, you have that CB peripheral, which is the device. In our example, it's a heart rate monitor. It could also be a thermometer. It could be an Arduino, whatever. It's just a physical device that you connect to, and it is going to advertise one or more services. A service, stored as a CB service, is essentially a group of related functions, such as all heart rate related characteristics, maybe on like an Apple Watch, so on and so forth. A characteristic, stored as a CB characteristic, is the actual data point that you are trying to interact with, and that might be something like a sensor reading or a control command, and it's going to hold a value that is the value that you're actually reading or writing, and optional descriptors. Finally, the value itself is stored as a CB characteristic dot value. So you're essentially just accessing that value in that characteristic, and that's literally the raw data that you actually want to read or write. So remember, those CB characteristics actually contain those values, but then the values are those values. Now, if we continue along, I just have a alternate kind of like visual of how this works. You'll have multiple peripheral devices that you can connect to. Once you connect to one, you can then look through its services. So this device has, let's say, 2 services. Each service is going to have its own characteristics. Each characteristic has its value and its descriptor, such as those properties that we saw before, saying, oh, you can read, or you can read and notify, or you can read and write, or maybe you can only write to it. And then those characteristics also have those values, which are the values that you're actually going to want to access and use in your app. So here's an example of a thermostat. Let's say you have a Bluetooth thermostat that you are connecting your phone to. That thermostat might have multiple services. One service is the temperature service. The other is the battery service. That battery service is going to have a characteristic called battery level, which is probably just going to be a readable value, and that value might be 80%. In the temperature service, you might have 2 characteristics. The current temperature, which is the temperature that your thermostat is reading from the environment, and then your desired temperature, which is the temperature that you've set your thermostat to keep your environment at. So let's say your current temperature is 60 degrees Fahrenheit. In your app, you might access that and try and show that to the user. And then let's say your desired temperature is 70 degrees. Desired temperature might have the option to be written to. So in your app, you might have the option to increase that temperature, decrease that temperature to whatever your desired value is. And then that Bluetooth device is going to have its own programming that's going to say, hey, our value is 60 degrees and our desired temperature is 70 degrees. Let's crank that heater until we get up to 70 degrees. Anyway, so this is a super quick lesson to just kind of show you how Bluetooth devices are modeled inside of Swift. We're going to hop into a code example so that you guys can see how this works and get an idea of what the code to do this and interact with those parts actually looks like. So jumping into our code example here, I'll just run through this real quick to give you an idea of how exploring these devices actually works. First off, if you come up here, you got to make sure that you go to your info plist and you add this Bluetooth always usage description so that you can utilize Bluetooth on your user's device. If you don't do that, your app will crash. And then in our flow example, this is some very just basic, essentially templated code to show you what the overall process looks like here. So this first chunk, BLE manager NS object, this is just some object that we're going to use to manage Bluetooth devices. First, we have our CB Central Manager. We went over this in lesson 1. So again, go back and watch that if you haven't seen it, but this is essentially representing your local iPhone device. Then you have your actual peripheral, that's your CB peripheral, as we saw in the slides. That is the actual Bluetooth device that you're connecting your phone to. So this is your managing your phone, this is managing your peripheral. Then in our initializer, we're just saying that our central manager is going to be this object, and we're setting the queue to be main. This is some multi-threading stuff, but we're essentially saying that we're going to run all of this on the main thread. Again, we get more into that in the previous episode. Now, in order to be the central manager, we need to conform to the CB central manager delegate, essentially saying, hey, this object is going to handle all of the tasks that the CB central manager handles. So there are 3 key functions that the manager has to take care of. The first is central manager did update state. That's essentially saying, did the state of your iOS device change? So central, there are a couple of options that you have here: powered on, power off, resetting, unauthorized, unknown, unsupported, none, blah, blah, blah. Those are essentially the states that your device can be in. Anytime your phone, your central device changes state, this function is going to get called and you're going to say how you should handle it. Obviously, we're not handling any of the other states. We're just saying, hey, if our central is powered on, then let's go ahead and scan for peripherals with services nil. This is just saying we're going to look for all peripherals. We could define what specific services we want to actually scan for. So we would only find Bluetooth devices that have, let's say, that heart rate service or whatever, or a temperature service. Next, you have this found a peripheral function, which is going to be called whenever a peripheral is discovered, and it's going to have the data for that peripheral. So in this case, what we're doing is just saying, okay, the first of any peripherals that we find, let's just connect with that one. Now, this obviously isn't a practical use case, but it's kind of just showing the process that we're going to go through. So once a peripheral is found, this function gets called. In the previous tutorial, what we were doing when that was found was we were saying, hey, the central manager discovered a peripheral, let's add that peripheral to the devices that we're keeping track of, those devices being stored in our Bluetooth manager, a little bit more in a slightly more complex way. But right here, we're just saying like, okay, we found a peripheral, we're going to connect to it, and we're also going to stop scanning for other peripherals. So if in here we were to add that device to a list, then in the UI, the user could select from a list of devices to connect to, and then we would call, hey, central manager, connect to that peripheral, we'd make that connection. And then once you've made that connection, this next function automatically gets called. Central manager did connect. And this is where we essentially handle any logic that we want to perform once we've connected to a device. So in this case, we're setting this peripheral delegate to be the self. Now you could use a separate object to manage a specific peripheral, but in this case, we're just going to have our Bluetooth low energy manager manage that function. Then right here, we're saying, let's take that peripheral and let's start discovering devices. Now what that function does is it discovers the specified services of the peripheral. So you can pass in a set of service UUIDs so that we're only looking for certain services, or you can pass in nil so that you can find all of the services. It's worth pointing out that all of these functions are automatically called when certain things happen. It's not you that's calling these functions. It's these functions happening as a byproduct of other things happening. So in this case, the flow all happens automatically where we connect the central manager to be managed by this object. The central is this device. When we do that, that device updates its state. Now we handle that updated state and we start scanning for peripherals. Now we have no control over whether or not the device actually discovers a peripheral, but once the device does discover a peripheral, then it will call this function and then we decide what to do within that function. Now we're deciding to connect. If we were just adding each of these peripherals to a list of devices like we were in the last lesson, then this next function isn't going to be automatically called when this function finishes running. It's just going to take this peripheral and store it in here, and then maybe we'll have a user interface side event where the user selects a peripheral to connect to that calls this central.connect peripheral. Then once it's connected, then we call this. Now the CB peripheral delegate is essentially the delegation for all of the peripheral oriented functions. So first off, we need to discover services. Since up here we said discover services, the device is going to start searching for services in that Bluetooth device. Once it did discover services, it'll call the body of this function. In this function, we're just looking at all of the services and saying, hey, we found this service with this unique ID. Now let's look for any characteristics, right? So you can see in this function, we've started to go down that tree where first we found that peripheral and now we're in that tree and we're saying like, okay, let's look at these services. Once we've found a service, we're going to look for the characteristics in that service. As soon as a characteristic is discovered for a service, we're going to be able to look at all of those characteristics, assuming there are some, and print those characteristics, read the values for those characteristics, and if it has the option to notify us, we're essentially going to subscribe to that characteristic. Finally, this function handles what should happen if we get an updated value, which essentially means the peripheral device said, oh, hey, we have a new value, sent that to us. If we do nothing in here, nothing's going to happen with that. But we could also say, okay, let's get that value and then print it. Or if you have some user interface, in the case of the thermostat that's displaying the temperature of your house, then when it gets that updated value, it will say, hey, user interface, display the new temperature. That's it for lesson 2. In the next episode, we'll actually start to look at the actual objects involved, get a full look at each delegate available, each object that we want to interact with in core Bluetooth, and then we'll start actually looking at some examples where we're actually using real applications, and we might actually try and integrate with an Arduino Bluetooth device where we create our own services, our own characteristics, our own values, and you can start reading and writing to and from that device. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed. Like this video, subscribe, give me a comment if there are any concepts or ideas that you would like me to explore in the future, or any questions in particular that you have about what I covered in this video. All right, adios. See you next time. Goodbye.